Well, if you were here last week, we were talking about chapter 1, and we talked about how the gospel keeps moving, right? How the gospel keeps moving even in the places we wouldn't expect, because Paul was in prison, right? And he is seeing how the gospel now is moving within his present circumstances, even through his suffering, even through flawed people that had questionable motives that were kind of trying to take advantage of his situation. Well, this week, Paul turns the question kind of back on us, right? He says, okay, if that's true, if the gospel is still moving, if God is still at work even in difficult circumstances, what kind of people are we becoming in the process? Ooh, that's a hard question, right? What kind of people are we becoming? Because it's one thing to say the gospel is advancing, woohoo! It's another thing entirely to let that gospel reshape how we live, how we suffer, and how we carry one another, right? Paul begins with what the community already knows. He is naming what they have already tasted, what they have already experienced. If there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, these aren't hypotheticals, not for this community. This is their lived reality, right? So Paul says, because you have experienced Christ, let your life reflect that reality. Let your life reflect what you have experienced. Be of the same mind, have the same love, be in full accord. And then he defines what that actually looks like, which maybe is a little harder. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. And that phrase, selfish ambition. We heard that in last week's text, right? Only it was, despite selfish ambitions, the gospel's still moving, right? Even that can't stop the gospel. But now he's going to make something clear. He says, yes, God can work through distortion. He can work through questionable motives. However, that does not mean distortion is what should define the church or this community. And this is where Paul gets very concrete. He says, let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus Christ. Okay, so what was Christ like? And then he tells us what Christ was like. That confession of who Christ is and what Christ does. He does not cling to power. He doesn't exploit his position over others. Instead, he empties himself of all of that, taking the form of a servant. Now, a servant is not a soft spiritual metaphor, right? In Paul's world, a servant existed to absorb the burden of someone else, to do the work for somebody else. So the other person could live more comfortably, probably live a longer life, because they do the work. They carry the weight. They take on the cost, so another life is easier, another life is longer, and another life is more secure. And usually, they are very exploited. So when Paul says Christ took the form of a servant, he is saying Christ chose to absorb the weight of the world so that others might live. He stepped into the full force of human brokenness. He stepped into how humanity treats other humans at its worst. Not to avoid it, not to explain it, but to carry it, to enter into it, to be that. The violence, the injustice, the consequences of human sin lands on him, and he does not deflect it. But Paul doesn't stop at just describing what Christ did, right? I mean, that's all well and good for Jesus. Yahoo, thanks, Jesus. He turns it into, let the same mind be in you. Oh. Which means it's not just something we admire about Jesus. It's something that begins to shape us in how we live and how we be. Not the sense that we save each other. That work, of course, belongs to Jesus. We aren't out there trying to save people. Jesus does that. But in the sense that we refuse to let one another be crushed. We refuse to let one another carry a burden on their own. And this is where we need to correct something we often get wrong, because we tend to think of suffering as something that's individual, right? It's just my problem to deal with, or it's just their problem to deal with. My struggle, my burden, my faith. But Paul is writing to an entire community, which means suffering is not meant to be carried alone. It is not meant to be just this individualized problem. The Christian life is not one person absorbing everything while everyone else can benefit. It is a shared life where burdens are redistributed. Where one person is overwhelmed, others need to step in and help out. Where no one's hardship remains private property. At its best, the church becomes a place where individual struggles are transformed into a collective testimony. Where what one person endures becomes something the whole community carries and is changed by. And then Paul says something that sounds at first kind of like a contradiction, right? Then he says that fun thing that a lot of us like to throw around when we're, mad at somebody or something. We say, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And if we're not careful, that sounds a lot like, well, you just need to try harder, do more, and figure it out on your own, right? That's what that sounds like. But you have to look at where it comes in this letter. It comes after the confession of who and what Christ is and what Christ has done. This is not a condition for grace. It's the response to grace. It is the response to what has been done. We are not working for salvation. We are working because of salvation. And the language matters. Work it out in the Greek is not a one-time action. It is ongoing. It is continuous. It is something that you are continuing to work and become and be transformed and changed. Think of it like a blacksmith shaping metal, strike after strike until something new takes form. That is the life of faith. It is not a single decision, but a sustained practice throughout your life. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. A life being formed over time into the pattern of Christ, into this pattern of emptying ourselves for the other, to be there for the other. Which means the question is no longer simply, well, what do you believe? It becomes, how does what you believe shape your life, right? What is your life being shaped into because of this faith? It's entirely possible to claim faith and never actually live it, right? To say the right thing, still be governed by self-interest, competition, control. And Paul is not interested in just a mere confession. He's interested in formation. He is interested in whether the life of Christ is actually taking shape within a community of people. And then he grounds the whole thing by saying, for it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So even this working, this shaping, this effort isn't something that we do completely on our own. God is at work. God is the actor, the one moving, the one shaping, The question is whether we are resisting that work or we are participating in it. So here's the movement Paul's making. The gospel is advancing even through suffering, even through flawed people. And because that is true, we are called to become a people shaped by that same self-giving life, that same self-giving love that Jesus himself gave to us. A people who carry one another's burdens, people who refuse to let suffering isolate someone. Take seriously the work of being formed by grace. Not to earn anything, but because something has already been given. And Paul isn't telling them or us to go find encouragement, go find love or the Spirit. He's saying, you already know these things. You already know these things. You've already experienced these things. The question is, will your life together as a community actually reflect what you have already received?